So good day everyone. So now let's talk about the perspective of the self from philosophers. So before we all start, let me tell you that this is for educational purposes only. Our instructor Mr. Roldan Ardines let us use this as our educational material. Sure.
Now let's go to the first three Greek philosophers, which is known as the Greek triumvirate, namely Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now let's go to Socrates first. Socrates believed that the self exists in two parts. The body, soul, and are attached, therefore making both parts of ours is ourself. So present in the physical realm. Well, when we die, our body stays in the physical realm while our soul travels in the ideal realm, making our soul immortal. So these states reflect that Socrates has a dualistic view of the self, where he posits that the self consists of two distinct parts, the body, soul. So according to Socrates, the body and the soul is interconnected during a person's life, with the soul being the immortal or the higher aspect that transcends to the physical realm. So in Socrates' philosophy, the body represents the physical and the mortal aspect of the self, tied to the material world and subjected to decay and impermanence. On the other hand, the soul is considered the essence of a person's embodiment, or embodying their intellect, emotion, consciousness, and Socrates believed that the soul is internal and belongs to the realm of ideals or forms separate from the physical world. Now let's go to the second Greek philosopher, namely Plato. So Plato's definition of self is that our soul is the only thing that is unchangeable and internal. The body is either a shell or a prison to house our soul. So our soul is the divine and composed of virtues such as love, courage, wisdom, and many others. So Plato's definition of the self delves into the dualistic nature of human existence, emphasizing the internal and unchanging essence of a soul contrasted with the transcendent and the impermanent nature of the body. According to Plato, the self is primarily defined by soul, which he considered to be a core of the person's identity and the seat of their virtues. So in Plato's philosophy, the body is viewed as a temporary vessel or the prison that houses the immortal soul. The body is subjected to the limitation of the physical world, including aging, illness, and mortality, while the soul is the internal and unchanging representing the essence of a person's true self. So Plato's concept of the soul as divine and composed of virtues such as love, courage, wisdom, or it reflects his belief in the inheritance of God's goodness and moral of the nature. Now let's go to the last ancient Greek philosopher, which is Aristotle. So Aristotle's concept of the self is holomorphic. So the self of the human person is composed of a body and a soul again, and these two now is inseparable or inseparable. Thus we cannot talk about the self with the soul only, or the self with the body only. For Aristotle, the self is its essence, or essentially body and the soul. So Aristotle's concept of the self, known as hylomorphism, offers a unique perspective on the nature of human being by emphasizing the inseparable connection between the body and the soul. In Aristotle's philosophy, the self or the human person is seen as a composite entity consisting of both physical matter, the body, and the non-material aspect, which is the soul. This hylomorphic view rejects the dualistic separation of body and soul found in the other philosophers, such as Plato and Socrates. Instead, this posits that the self is a fundamental unit of a body and a soul. According to Aristotle, the body and the soul is interdependent and cannot exist isolation from each other. The body serves as the material component of the self, providing a physical structure and capabilities necessary for human existence and experiments. On the other hand, the soul represents the immaterial aspect of the self, encompassing the intellectual, emotion, and violation capacities. that define human consistent and agencies. So by considering the self as essential body and soul, Aristotle's hylomorphic concept offers a nuanced understanding of human's identity that acknowledges the complex interplay between physical embodiment and spiritual essence. This view underscores the integrated nature of the self, recognizing the profound influence of both the material and immaterial aspect of shaping humans' existence, behavior, and flourishing.
So let's go to medieval philosophy. So Saint Augustine's understanding of the self involves soul, the mind, and the consciousness with a focus on the role of the intellect. He also delves into existential concepts such as subjectivity, despair, and passion, concerning human dignity, original sin, and the inward journey of the self. So human dignity is significant in Augustine's view as it emphasizes that every individual possesses inherent value and worth as created in God's image. Augustine addresses original sin as a fundamental aspect of human nature that affects moral development and understanding of oneself. The inward journey of the self, according to Augustine, is the exploration of one's inner thoughts, desire, and emotion to gain a deeper understanding of oneself and their relationship with God. Augustine views intellect as crucial in shaping consciousness by providing knowledge and insight into essential and purpose. Example from Augustine's work includes Confession on Free Choice on the Trinity and the City of God, which discuss human nature, morality, faith, and knowledge. Saint Augustine believed one can achieve spiritual growth through introspection, repentance for sin, including original sins, seeking knowledge about God, through faith, living accordance to moral virtues for union with God's true power.
Anthony de Mello, a Jesuit priest and spiritual teacher, had a unique perspective on the self. De Mello emphasized the importance of self-awareness and self-discovery in his teachings. He believed that true happiness and fulfillment come from understanding oneself deeply and being free from illusions and detachments. According to De Mello, the true self is free from attachments, fears, and desires, and it is in a state of awareness that one finds true peace and fulfillment. He encouraged practices such as mindfulness and self-inquiry to facilitate this awakening process.
So let's go to modern philosophy. Descartes' view on personal identity and individuality implies that each person's unique thoughts, feelings, and consciousness contribute to their distinct sense of self. Descartes believed that in free will, as an inherent aspect of human nature within our minds, this aligns with his concept of self where our minds play a central role in shaping who we are. One criticism faced by Descartes' concept of self is its potential neglecting other factors such as emotion, social interaction in defining one's identity. Additionally, some argue that this perspective may lead to an overly individualized understanding of human nature at the expense of other important aspects. Descartes' concept of self has had significant impact on philosophy and continues to influential today. It emphasizes that the mind as the primary source of individual identity and consciousness, suggesting that our thoughts, perceptions, and feelings shape who we are. This perspective has contributed to discussion about personal identity, individuality, free will, and the nature of human existence. However, it has also faced criticism for potential overlooking other factors such as emotion or social interaction in defining oneself.
John Locke. John Locke was an English philosopher and physician widely regarded as one of the most influential of English thinkers and commonly known as the father of liberalism. Locke proposed the theory of tabula rasa, or the idea that the mind is a blank slate at birth shaped by experience. He believed that personal identity arises from consciousness, memory, and continuity of experience rather than from a fixed, unchanging soul. According to John Locke, the self is defined by consciousness, which is awareness of one's own thoughts and experience over time. He proposed that personal identity consists of continuous stream to consciousness rather than any specific substance or soul.
David Hume. David Hume, he argued that there is no underlying substance present to the self. Rather, it is merely a collection or bundle of perceptions and experiences. Hume famously stated that when he introspected, he couldn't find a unified, enduring self but rather a stream of ever-changing thoughts and sensations.
Kant. He argued that the self is not a passive recipient of sensory experience but actively organized and structures sensory data through innate mental structure he called categories and forms of intuition. Kant rejected the idea of a distinct immaterial soul. Instead, he viewed the self as a necessary condition for experiencing the world, synthesized from both sensory experience and innate cognitive structures.
Patricia Churchland. Patricia Churchland suggests that a traditional concept of the self as a unified and enduring entity is an outdated notion that will be eventually replaced by a scientific understanding of the brain. From her perspective, the self is an emergent phenomenon of the brain's activity rather than a separate immaterial entity.
Edmund Husserl. Husserl argued that the self is not something that can be observed as an object, but rather the very subjectivity through which all experiences are constituted. For Husserl, the self is not a fixed entity but an ongoing process of self-awareness and intentionally. Through the phenomenological method, he sought to uncover the structures of consciousness and the ways in which self shapes and interprets the world.
So let's talk about another philosopher from postmodernism. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So her perspective of self rejected the idea of disembodied, purely rational self and instead proposed that the self emerged through our bodily engagement with the world. She coined the term the flesh to describe the intertwining of the body, perception, and consciousness, emphasizing the holistic and dynamic nature of human existence. The self is not a detached or observer, but an embodied agent, deeply embedded in the world, constantly engaged in a process and perception of action. So Morley's perspective on the self revolves around the idea of embodied subjectivity and emphasize the inseparability of self from the body and the world, rejecting the traditional dualistic view and separates mind and body. According to Ponty, our perception of the world is not just a mental representation, but it's deeply intertwined with our bodily experiences and interactions with the environment. He argues that the self is not detached observer but is immersed in the world through the bodily existence. Ponty's phenomenological approach focuses on the lived experience of the self as embodied and situated within the surroundings, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the self, the body, and the world.
Hi guys, I'm Aksara Bachaga and I'm going to discuss the perspective of the self with the various philosophers in postmodernism. So what is postmodernism? So postmodernism in its approach to the self relies on the idea that the self is not fixed or essential as entity but is instead a fluid and socially constructed concept. So postmodernism perspective on the self underscores the idea that identity is not inherent but constructed through social interactions and subject to ongoing transformation and redefinition, in which some thinkers challenge traditionally notions of a unified, stable self, emphasizing the fragmented and contingent nature of identity. Also, one of the thinkers of postmodernism is Davida. So Davida views the self as a fragmented fluid that emphasizes its ever-evolving nature, shaped by social interactions. The self is complex, influenced by power, dynamics, and norms and historical context. So Davida, the perspective of the self is aligned with the postmodernism notions. The self is not fixed or essential, but essential entity, but is constantly evolving and constructed through interactions with societal and culture. One of the thinkers of postmodernism is Michael Foucault. Michael Foucault views the self in fluid and socially constructed entity, challenging fixed identities. Foucault's perspective on the self is within the framework of postmodernism, which emphasizes the fluidity and complexity of identity that emphasize how individuals are product of social influence and power dynamics.
Here's the breakdown of his views. So, rejection of fixed identities. Rorty argues against the idea that individuals have an essential, unchanging core identity. Instead, he believes that our sense of self is not static. So, the second is fluidity of the self. According to Rorty, the self is dynamic and evolves over time. Our identities are constantly being redefined through our experiences, interactions, and reflections. So this states that we can change. It is not a constant. It's a constant about ourselves, so we evolve more. Third is the personal narrative. Rorty highlights that individuals construct their identities through the stories they tell about themselves. These narratives are how we make sense of who we are and who we want to be. Fourth is the contingent nature of identity. He emphasizes that our identities are contingent, meaning they are dependent on various factors like culture, history, and personal choices, rather than being predetermined or essential. Fifth is the challenge to essentialism. So traditional essentialist views suggest that there is a fundamental, inherent essence to who we are. So Rorty challenges this by arguing that our identities are not given but made, and they can change as our narratives and circumstances change. So, to summarize it all, Rorty sees the self as a product of ongoing personal storytelling influenced by content and choice rather than a fixed essence. This perspective opens up possibilities for self creation and transformation, moving away from rigid definitions of identity. So next is the in Eastern philosophy, like Buddhism and Hinduism. The concept of anatta Buddhism or Anatman Hinduism challenges Western views by highlighting the transient and interconnected nature of self. This tradition views self as an illusion created by mind, emphasizing impermanence and interconnectedness with the world. Practices like meditation aim to understand or transcend the ego's limitations and realize a deeper unity with the universe. Let's dive into Buddhism. So, anatta or no self doctrine. Buddhism teaches the doctrine of anatta or Pali or anatman Sanskrit, which means no self or non-self. This doctrine asserts that there is no permanent, unchanging self or soul. Second is the impermanence. The self is seen as a collection of transcendent physical and mental components form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness that are constantly changing. Third is the interconnectedness. Everything is interconnected and interdependent. The self is an illusion created by mind, leading to mistaken belief in a separate, enduring identity. Anatman in Hinduism, or it is said as non-self, in certain schools of Hinduism, particularly in Advaita Vedanta, the term Anatman is issued similarly to denote the idea that the individual self is not the ultimate reality. So Atman or true self, instead the true self, Atman is considered the identical with Brahman, the ultimate infinite reality, the ego or personal identity as seen as false self. So practices and realization, meditation and mindfulness. Both Buddhism and Hinduism use practices like meditation to help individuals see through the illusions of the ego. So transcending the ego. These practices aim to transcend the limitations of the ego and realize the deeper truth of impermanence and interconnectedness. Unity of the universe. The ultimate goal is to experience a sense of unity with the universe, going beyond the illusory self to recognize the oneness of all existence. So in summary, or all in all, Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and certain schools of Hinduism challenge the Western notion of a permanent, independent self. They emphasize the self is an illusion, stressing impermanence and interconnectedness. Through meditation and mindfulness, individuals can transcend the ego and realize a deeper unity with the universe. Now we reached to the end of our topic. So let's say na various philosophers have their perspectives of the self and how they think differently. So let's study and hope you learn everything.